Imagine walking through a bustling medieval marketplace. The air is thick with the scent of freshly baked bread, livestock, and the metallic tang of blacksmiths at work. Bells ring from a distant church tower. Suddenly, the crowd parts. All eyes turn toward a wooden platform where a woman, barefoot and trembling, is being led in chains. A parchment nailed to a post declares her crime in bold Latin letters. Adulterium. Adultery. Lust. In an age when honor was everything and reputation was the currency of survival, accusations of desire carried a heavy price. The Middle Ages did not treat such sins of the flesh as private matters. They were public crimes, threats to the social order, the family line, and the authority of both church and crown. Why was lust so feared? In a world obsessed with lineage, inheritance, and divine judgment, desire was not seen as personal, it was political. A nobleman's heir had to be unquestionably his own. A merchant's daughter had to marry as her family commanded. Even peasants, though bound by fewer written laws, faced the judgment of their neighbors, who saw unchecked desire as a dangerous spark that could burn through fragile village bonds. This video explores how medieval society tried to control human passion through fear, shame, and brutal spectacle. And while some punishments may sound strange or even absurd to us today, they reveal a chilling truth. The fight to regulate desire has always been about power. In medieval Europe, morality was not just a private matter, it was the foundation of law. The church proclaimed that lust led to damnation. Kings and city councils declared it led to disorder. Together, they forged a partnership. Priests denounced adultery from the pulpit, and secular courts punished it in the streets. Penances could be spiritual or physical. A confessor might demand long pilgrimages barefoot, wearing sackcloth, or fasting on bread and water. But if your sin was widely known, or politically inconvenient, church penance wasn't enough. Civil courts stepped in to make an example of you. Women were especially targeted. While men could sometimes settle their offenses with fines or favors, women risked being branded for life. Literally. Why? Because a woman's body was seen as the gatekeeper of family honor. A noblewoman accused of adultery might doom alliances carefully arranged by her relatives. A peasant girl rumored to be loose might destroy her family's chances for a good marriage contract. Picture a medieval town square at noon. The sun is high, the market is crowded, and the entire village gathers to see justice done. Accused adulterers were not quietly tried behind closed doors. They were displayed like living warnings. Some were forced to parade through the streets half-dressed, led by a rope like livestock. Others wore strange, humiliating costumes. Heavy cloaks painted with symbols of their crime, or iron collars with bells so no one could miss them passing by. The message was clear: your desire has made you less than human. In German towns, records speak of women convicted of infidelity being forced to wear veils smeared with tar and feathers. In England, a husband might literally drag his unfaithful wife through the mud, legally permitted to display her shame. In parts of France and Italy, couples accused of adultery were tied together and marched around town while onlookers jeered. This was punishment as theater justice turned into a grim festival. Children laughed, merchants shouted insults, and priests blessed the crowd for witnessing the spectacle. Everyone was reminded that lust was not a private failing. It was a crime against society. Some punishments focused on silencing women, literally. One infamous device was the scold's bridle, an iron cage locked around the head, with a plate or spike that pressed down on the tongue. While often used for nagging wives or unruly women, it was also employed when a woman's reputation for lust became too scandalous to ignore. Imagine standing in a crowded market, unable to speak, while a heavy iron mask cuts into your skin. The ringing of the bridle's attached bell ensured everyone turned to look. It didn't just hurt. It declared to the world that your words, your desires, and your very voice were dangerous. The symbolism was unmistakable. Medieval society feared not only what women did, but what they might say. Rumors, confessions, or defiance. Controlling desire often meant controlling speech. Not all punishments fell on women alone. Men accused of adultery or lewdness could also be locked in the pillory or stocks, exposed to public ridicule. But even here, the punishments were unequal. A wealthy man might bribe officials or rely on political connections to soften his sentence. A poor man, or a man who embarrassed someone powerful, had no such shield. In some cities, adulterers were locked side by side in wooden frames, forced to endure hours of taunts, rotten vegetables, and sometimes worse from the crowd. The idea was to make sin disgusting, not just dangerous. Shame was a tool of social control, more feared than physical pain. For nobles, adultery was more than a moral offense. It was treason against family and bloodline. Noble women caught in scandal sometimes faced confinement in remote castles or forced entry into convents. Men who seduced them risked exile, mutilation, or execution, not always for the lust, but because they had threatened dynastic power. In 1313, the scandal of Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy, accused of adultery with knights, rocked the French royal court. The women were imprisoned for life, their lovers executed. The case was as much about controlling royal bloodlines as punishing personal sin. The deeper we look, the more we see a pattern. Medieval punishments for lust and adultery weren't about protecting love or marriage. They were about maintaining control over inheritance, over alliances, over women's bodies and men's ambitions. In the rigid moral order of the Middle Ages, the body was not seen as one's own. It belonged to family, community, and above all to God. To step outside those expectations, to follow desire rather than duty, was treated as rebellion against the divine itself. Consider the case of the bridal garland trials in parts of Germany. If a young woman was suspected of premarital relations, villagers would test whether her wedding garland, a crown of flowers symbolizing her chastity, would float or sink in water. A sinking garland was taken as proof of impurity, a verdict followed by public penance or marriage arranged in haste to restore honor. The truth didn't matter. The spectacle did. Shame became a form of theater. Women accused of adultery might be forced to ride through the streets backward on a donkey, wearing nothing but a shift, with crowds hurling insults and refuse. Men, though punished too, often faced lighter penalties, a fine, a pilgrimage, or a public confession. In every case, these punishments sent a clear message. Sexual behavior was not private. It was a matter for the entire community to judge, parade, and correct. In England, church courts oversaw most cases of fornication and lechery. Rather than bloody torture, they favored public humiliation. Offenders might stand barefoot in a marketplace holding a rod, or be forced to walk around the parish church during Mass while everyone looked on. Their neighbors became their jailers. But in harsher jurisdictions, physical pain accompanied social disgrace. In certain towns of Italy and France, women accused of infidelity risked being branded on the forehead or having their hair shorn off, a living mark of dishonor. Husbands sometimes paraded wives through the streets, forcing them to confess, while magistrates looked the other way. These were punishments wrapped in ceremony, meant to remind everyone that marriage was less about love and more about obedience and control. Even the very instruments of justice were designed to humiliate. The scold's bridle, or brank, was a metal cage locked around the head, with a bit of iron pressed into the mouth to prevent speech. Although it was more commonly used on women accused of gossip or quarrelsomeness, it sometimes punished those whose unchaste talk offended local morality. Imagine standing in a marketplace, face encased in cold iron, while your neighbors jeered, a living warning against both desire and defiance. In other places, elaborate chivalries or rough music parades punished suspected adulterers. Drums, bells, and pots clanged outside their homes at night, crowds chanting and mocking until the offenders appeared, terrified and exposed. These rituals were rowdy, but they carried real danger. Sometimes the mob's fury went beyond noise. Stones were thrown, doors broken, lives destroyed without any formal trial. And while many punishments fell on women, men were not immune. In some Italian city-states, adulterous husbands could be paraded in nothing but their shirts, holding candles as they begged forgiveness from the church. In German towns, men convicted of lechery might be locked in the pillory beside their lovers, both forced to endure the laughter of the crowd. Yet even here, power tilted sharply. Noblemen often escaped with a fine, while poorer folk faced the whip or worse. The church framed these harsh measures as medicine for the soul. Priests warned that uncontrolled lust would bring famine, plague, and war as divine punishment. Controlling the flesh was presented as saving not just the individual, but the entire community. The message was clear. Desire was dangerous, especially when it challenged authority. By the late Middle Ages, secular rulers also used these moral laws for political ends. Kings and city councils issued new edicts against adultery, partly to assert their own authority over the church. In Florence during the 15th century, public officials recorded every case of immorality, turning sin into a matter of state surveillance. Punishments became tools not just of piety, but of power. But there were moments of quiet resistance. Chronicles tell of villagers hiding lovers from roaming magistrates, of neighbors refusing to denounce friends, of women wearing wigs to cover shaved heads and reclaim their dignity. The human heart rarely bends as neatly as lawgivers wish. By the Renaissance, attitudes began to shift. Humanist thinkers questioned whether the state had any right to police private love. Yet the old punishments did not vanish overnight. In some rural districts, stocks, pillories, and donkey parades continued well into the 17th century. Relics of a medieval world where desire itself was treated as a crime. What do these stories tell us? That fear and shame were once considered powerful tools of governance. That controlling intimacy was never just about faith or morality. It was about who held the power to decide whose love was acceptable and whose body belonged to whom. And perhaps most unsettling of all, that crowds often enjoyed these spectacles. Public punishments were not only warnings, they were entertainment. A way for neighbors to feel righteous at someone else's expense. A way to remind everyone that the walls between private and public life were paper-thin. When we look back on these practices today, it's easy to imagine a world utterly unlike our own. But the echoes of these punishments linger, in the desire to shame rather than understand, in laws that still try to dictate the most intimate parts of life, in the instinct to watch, to judge, and to punish. The Middle Ages remind us that morality, when wielded as a weapon, can be as brutal as any sword, that fear can make ordinary people complicit in cruelty, and that behind every donkey parade, every ringing bell, every iron brank, there was not just an abstract sin, there was a human being. Someone whose only crime may have been loving the wrong person or loving too freely.